there is only one really good way to know the culture, and that's through the food. I mean, you're not going to get anywhere talking computers, really, unless you come across a computer geek. But food, it's the language of understanding. You don't even have to speak each other's language. You can communicate.
Hello! Welcome to The Corner Table, a Capital Times podcast about food and drink in Madison. Joan Peterson has been all over the world. She's a researcher and a writer with a voracious appetite for culinary travel. With Gingko Press in Madison, she's published 14 Eat Smart guides to countries from Peru and Brazil to Denmark and Norway. Her latest, with Ronnie Hess, is a guide to Portugal, published last fall. I'm your host, Cap Times food writer Lindsay Christians. Joan and her daughter Susan joined me on the podcast this week to talk about how each of these educational guides comes together, from the recipes to the glossary of food terms. Give a listen. Hello, welcome.
Hello, this is Joan.
Thank you guys for coming in today. So first of all, I'd love to have you just introduce yourselves for folks. Let them know who you are and a little bit about what you do.
I'm Joan Peterson, and I started a publishing company in the early 90s called Gingko Press, and we publish and write, along with other authors, the Eat Smart Culinary Travel Guidebook series. And at the end of the 90s, we started leading culinary tours around the world.
How many books are in the series now?
14.
Wonderful. So, and Susan?
Yes, I'm Susan. I'm Joan's daughter, and I started with Gingko Press in 1997. And so it's been a great ride. I've been more in the background doing some of the behind the scenes projects, but it's been really fun to be working with my mom.
So what is your role? Do you edit the books? Do you produce them?
I do more of the marketing, and I do all the graphics. So I'll put together all the research materials that they have, and do all the editing of the photos, and do all the graphic design, get the book ready, get it ready for the printer.
That sounds like a lot.
Yeah, and website and everything else that goes with it.
Wonderful. So, Joan, tell me a little bit about the history of how you got started doing these guides. What was the first one, and why did you decide to do it?
Well, Brazil was the first one, and actually that was a default choice because when I decided to go ahead with this project, my husband and I had already booked tickets for a trip to Brazil, so that was number one. But as far as the others, my choices were based mostly on countries that I had been to before. My husband and I traveled extensively, and so my favorite country, as soon as I visited it, which has been my favorite country since, is Turkey. So Turkey was the next book. And Indonesia followed that, and that choice was because during the Vietnamese War, when my husband and I were entertaining the military, we were allowed to take a 2-week vacation in a 4-month stint. And one of the places we went to was Bali, and I fell in love with Bali as well. So Indonesia was that choice.
So I want to ask about that first trip, that first book,
Mm-hmm.
the Brazil book, because I know, for example, this is a much smaller example, but when I go to a restaurant and I am working and I'm going to be reviewing the place, it's a very different experience than when I go to a restaurant just to relax and to have a nice night out with my husband. So how was it different for you to go to Brazil knowing that you were going to be gathering material for a book versus going just to sort of relax and enjoy? Are they very different for you? Or are they
they are, but I think in the beginning, not knowing what I was doing, and also I should say that what I had wanted to do really was to do a pamphlet, not a book. I didn't even think about a book. And all I wanted to do was provide a list of menu items and foods and flavors in the language of the country we were visiting, and then the English translation. So I went with that idea, and then as we went around, I got to thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have some recipes? And then I thought maybe some chefs would like to contribute. And then the history of the food was so fascinating. And, of course, there were regional differences. So all of these topics became chapters. But at that point, my husband, who was interested in becoming involved, said, I really don't have time for a book. So he opted out of doing this. But the inspiration, actually, for my books followed my having a little spiral notebook with me for each country. And I wrote down the names of various foods that I wanted to be sure to try. And so when I got there, I realized that I had such a paltry list, and it was, just minorly helpful. And so I then decided, well, goodness gracious, I can write a bigger list than this. And of course we did.
I wonder, when you started working on these guides, did you identify that there was a sort of space in the travel guide field, in the world of, these kinds of publications that didn't talk enough about food, that didn't go as deep as you wanted, that you were looking for something that wasn't there when you were going to these countries and wanted to try all the different, aspects of the cuisine?
Well, at the time I started out, the idea in 1992, there were not any culinary travel guidebooks, and in fact, there were not any glossaries like our menu guide and foods and flavors guide, except there had been 4 of these menu guides, and I think it was the Marling series, and they covered 4 of the most traveled destinations, Spain, Italy, etc. And what I didn't want to do was cover those countries myself, because I wanted to go to destinations that were a little off the beaten track, because that was very interesting to me. So there was basically nothing available, and those other guides were not continued. So it was wide open.
How long does it take you to put together one of the books?
It varies, of course, but the research trip can be anywhere from 1 to 3 months, and then let's say about a year of the writing. And then during this time, our editor, may I mention her? Her name is Brooke Soltwet, and she was in graduate school when I was a postdoc in her husband's lab. She wrote Peru with me and is the editor of all the books. And so we would have to send chapters to her and back and forth and back and forth. So I would say maybe 2 years is an approximation.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a deep dive. Each of these individual books are a deep dive into these cuisines. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is the structure of them. So sort of starting out with this culinary history and going into some of the regional cuisines, and then sort of segueing into, you start to have some recipes and some phrases that you can use to order, and then the glossary. And I wonder about, is it challenging sometimes for you to say, we just don't have room for that, or we just can't fit that in, or do you try to fit in as much as you possibly can? How do you cull from all of what you get from your research trips?
Well, first of all, the premise is that the book is 160 pages, and they're all the same dimensions, same chapters, and same length. So it depends on what we might have a preference for. If we have some recipes that are from some very special chefs or some very special to the country, we want to make sure to include those. So we might nibble a little bit from every chapter in order to make the 160 pages.
In terms of the recipes, how do you think about how you want to present those? How do you, are you testing them, obviously, probably when you get back home to make sure that they work? How do you go about getting those recipes? That can be very challenging, I think, depending on who you're getting them from and where you're sourcing those.
We have had little problem getting recipes from the chefs. They're all interested in being a part of the book, and they will give us a recipe. Often it is one that they have demonstrated for us and explained and then served us. So we, learned quite a bit about each recipe. And so basically, that is how we went about it. And when we got home, we taste tested the recipe. And the first book or two, I think, I had my entire lab, not my lab, but it was the lab in which I was a postdoc, come over to my house. And they, almost blindfolded were, given the recipe. And so it was very interesting. But since then, we pretty much have done the taste testing ourselves, or I have actually. And if I have a co-author, then she, in case it has always been women who so far have been co-authors, will share this sort of thing. And, I should mention that we have had, about 5 co-authors, and they are all from Madison. And I think your listeners will certainly know Orange Schroeder, who owns Orange Tree Imports, and Ronnie Hess. She did France, and Orange did Denmark. And Mary Bergen, a local journalist, did Germany. And so those were the 3 who did books by themselves. But I co-authored with Indu Manan, whose husband was a professor in the biochemistry department. And I co-authored with Brooke Soltwet, my editor. I already mentioned that. So, I also co-authored with a woman who was here on campus. I didn't know her. She had gone back to Sicily. And so Marcella Croce and I did Sicily together.
Oh, I see. So, do you have to test those recipes over and over?
Yeah, I think the most challenging aspect of the recipes is the how we get the list of ingredients and the conversions. So it's a lot of trial and error, and it's a lot of fun when it's recipe trying time, trying to get the whatever, because they will say it in their language, and we'll try and write it down really quickly and try and produce it again. So it is quite fun.
When I think about going to another country with the idea of being able to bring something home that I can then put onto paper, there's a lot at stake, right? That you've got to get what you get when you're there. And I wonder if you have any stories about things that kind of were unexpected for you, or things that you maybe didn't anticipate would happen that were surprising in good ways and bad ways on these trips that you've taken.
Well, I think the most unusual episode happened in Morocco. And we had this would be my husband and I, we had a guide who lived in the Spanish part of the old Medina. And they had a lot of apartments that were accessed from outside on circular wrought iron staircases. And so she had invited us to come to her house for lunch because the Medina traditionally didn't have restaurants. People went home, and today I think it's still pretty much the same. So anyway, we thought it would be grand to go to a home, and we always love going to homes to test things. And so we went up to her apartment. She lived with a large family, her large family. And so we climbed those wrought iron staircase, and showed up at their apartment door. And there the family was waiting for us. There was a line of people. I think the youngest might have been, walking, so let's say maybe 2 years old, and then the granddads. And so I said hello to all of them, and then my eye moved beyond the line, and I saw on the kitchen floor a huge, dead, decapitated bull.
A bull?
Bull.
How big was that?
It was large, and I can remember my husband saying, "How in the world did you get the bull up here?" And one of those people used his hands and did this, like the bull walked up the 4-story circular staircase. And in truth, he did. And they say that once the bull starts, it's not going to back down, so it will just keep on going. So what you need to know is that that particular day was the day that people who had the wherewithal would prepare a certain meat product that would be kept all year. It would last all year. And this particular family apparently had the money, and they could use all of the meat. But the animal had been killed by the way of killing halal, which they slit the animal's throat and it bleeds to death, and it had bled to death on the floor. And I think about that little 2-year-old, what kind of, nightmares might he have?
Also, the cleanup. I mean, just
exactly.
from a practical standpoint.
Yeah, well, that had already been handled, but there was on the window ledge a huge bowl of fat. The animal had already been flayed, and the subcutaneous fat had been put into that bowl, and they were wanting to serve us for lunch kebabs made of the 3 most exciting parts. And they were the cheeks and the tongue and part of the neck.
Oh, my gosh. That sounds amazing.
And they were very good. They were very good.
Oh,
we were perfect guests. We didn't bat an eye. But, after 4 months eating all over the world and in the Orient, we were up for anything. But in any event, what they do is they were going to call in the imam to finish cutting up the animal. And they cut the meat into strips about 1 inch square and then, maybe 8 inches long or so. And they rub it with a spice mix that has coriander seed and cumin and salt and garlic, I guess. And then they hang it out to dry. They happen to be, as I said, on the 4th floor, so they had a deck or a rooftop place where they could hang it out, and they would bring it in at night and then go out and for 4 days. And once it was dried, they would boil it in the fat that was waiting, and they had added water to that fat, and they boiled it until the water was gone. And then they put it in containers and put in the liquid fat, and it would solidify. And then they would put a cap on it, and that would serve, for the whole year.
Yeah, it stores.
It's called kli. And you could buy it in the stores in individual jars for those who couldn't do the whole,
it's
the
a
whole
lot.
Animal. But it was probably the strangest situation we have ever found ourselves in.
How do you manage the language barrier? Do you have translators when you go?
We always have guides. And we work with an agency. And
a different one in each country?
Yes. And, for example, our agency in Turkey, we've had since 1998. And we're family.
And they sort of direct a little bit or help you have access to the places that you want to have access to?
Right. I have ideas where I want to go, places I've been, dishes I would like to try. And then as the years go on, some go out of business. There's some new ones, and they have suggestions to add. And they provide, as I said, a guide, and we have a driver. And once we get there, everything is planned. So there aren't any, worrisome things. And so it goes very smoothly.
What do you hope that people take away from the guides? Do you hope that it inspires them to travel there? Do you hope that they learn something that they haven't learned before? What do you hope to give to readers with each of these guides?
I hope that I give to readers a similar love that I have for new foods. I would like to have them try the foods. I would like to have them learn what they are and not go to restaurants that are set up with buffet style for tourists, but actually go to an authentic restaurant. And with our book in hand, they can, in fact, before they leave for the country, they can have read and figure out what they would really like to try. And everybody in these countries, are so happy to help. They will do anything. And even in the markets, for example, we would be in the markets. Nobody else would be in the markets. These are in one of these vast outdoor markets, mostly outdoor markets. And my husband was 6'4", and so he towered over just about everybody. And they came running to us and wanted to speak English to us, practice their English. Why are we here? And one of the trips to Turkey, there was a man who said, "Please don't leave yet, don't leave yet." And so he ran home and brought back his son, who was probably about 8 or 9, who was learning English. And we had such a wonderful conversation, and it was very animated. And the police came over and said, are you okay? Is everything all right? And we said, oh, yes, it's truly wonderful. So I think that there is only one really good way to know the culture, and that's through the food. I mean, you're not going to get anywhere talking computers, really, unless you come across a computer geek. But food, it's the language of understanding. You don't even have to speak each other's language. You can communicate.
That is amazing. Well, you've got a dinner coming up for your most recent guide, which is Eat Smart in Portugal, which came out last fall. Is that right?
Last fall, and my co-author was Madisonian Ronnie Hess.
Well, we're going to have a 5-course dinner paired with 5 different Portuguese wines. We are teaming up with VomFass and their culinary space called Delectable next Thursday, February 22nd, for a dinner with the authors. And just so happens that my husband is a local chef, and he will be preparing the meal along with their executive chef, Kristen. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Again, it'll be 5 courses and paired with the wines.
And give me just a little sampling of what some of the food is going to be.
We're going to start out with an octopus carpaccio, and then we're going to then have something called, well, in English it's cod fritters. Can you pronounce that?
That's
Portuguese?
fine.
Yeah. And then followed with a very traditional soup. It's the national soup of Portugal, and it's called caldo verde, which is a green soup, and then it'll be served with cornbread. And then we'll have a pork with clams dish. And then the dessert is one of their convent sweets, and it's called papas de anjo. And it is, in English, it translates to either angel's cheeks or angel's double chins, and it's made with egg yolk and tangerine syrup.
That is my favorite name for a dessert.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That sounds wonderful. And people can find out more about that.
Yeah, if you go to VomFass's website, or you can actually go to our website as well. There's 3 different seatings. There's a bar seating, a general seating, and then you can also sit around it's called the chef's table, so you're sitting around the island watching them prepare the dishes. And then Ronnie and Joan will be talking about the history of the food as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for coming in today.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This has been The Corner Table, a podcast about food and drink in Madison produced by the Capital Times. Our music was composed by Patrick Christians. More information about that Portuguese dinner is online at captimes.com and also at madison.vomfassusa.com. Subscribe to The Corner Table on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us on Facebook at Corner Table Podcast. I'm your host, Cap Times food writer Lindsay Christians. I love a rich, aromatic tawny port, so that's my wish for you this week, too. Stay warm, Madison. Cheers.